this has been a big shakeup of the politics of the Middle East. Turkey is much stronger. Iran, much weaker. Russia, much, much weaker. America has not actually been part of this big change. Europe, not really part of this big change. Let's be absolutely clear. It's in everyone's interest for Syria to be a sovereign territory.
David Miliband, really, really good to have you on the programme today. Let me ask you this then. Tell me, do you feel optimistic, is that the right word, about the future of Syria and the Syrian people today?
Well, I can tell you what our teams, the International Rescue Committee teams in Syria are saying. We've got about 850 people working there. They've been working throughout the long, brutal years of war. And optimistic isn't the word that they use, but hopeful is the word. They're conscious of the extraordinary risks when a government collapses, but they have the hope that decent people can find a life in Syria. They've been confined, our teams, to the northwest and the northeast. They've not been able to travel. They've been in rebel-held areas. And they think there's something to play for.
Yes. I mean, hopeful is, I think, probably a well-chosen word, and better in this context than optimistic. In the immediate term, does this change in Syria provide more of an opportunity for your organisation to do what your organisation does, which is to send in aid and assistance?
Well, we're a humanitarian aid agency. Syria has been in our top 10 countries at risk of humanitarian disaster throughout the last 10, 12 years of civil war. We never accepted or agreed with the proposition that the war was over and Assad had won, because there were still 16 million people in humanitarian need 2 weeks ago. And so we've, for example, had 450 people working in the northwest of the country where this alliance of opposition groups has been in charge. They've let us get on with our work. They've not stolen our money. They've not tried to tell us who we can help and who we can't help. They've allowed us to employ who we want to employ.
Yeah.
And obviously there are major priorities now, because aid needs to flow across borders. Refugees need to be supported when they go home to Syria, notably from Turkey and from Jordan and Lebanon, but also there are 16,000 Syrians in the UK. They'll be thinking about their future. And what I would say to people is, since we're today publishing the International Rescue Committee's 2025 emergency watch list, Syria is one of the top 10 countries. It's placed at number 4 on our list.
Yes.
And it's an avatar for the modern type of conflict and humanitarian need that exists, because it's a place of conflict. It's a place where international actors, international players are interfering in the civil war. It's a place where there's been extreme brutality, where more civilians have been killed than soldiers in the civil war. And it's also a place that faces the crushing burden of the climate crisis and of economic collapse.
Yes.
And so it's symptomatic of places like Sudan, Gaza, Myanmar, that are higher up on our list, but also of places like Democratic Republic of Congo that are below it, but still a massive catastrophe.
Yeah. I mean, the practical and the political in all that you do are intertwined in the judgments that you have to make constantly. There's now the man at the top of this new power, al-Jilani. He's promising, isn't he, to show pragmatism. That is his word. He's saying he wants to deliver stability and not oppression. But he's also, isn't he, a former al-Qaeda leader and an Islamist militant, which I guess must provide grounds for skepticism at the very least.
Well, everything that you've said there is well-chosen words. Politics does frame the humanitarian challenge. I always say to people, every humanitarian emergency is also a political emergency, both in its origins and in its consequences. Now, as a humanitarian agency, we are impartial and neutral. That's our biggest shield. We say to all conflict parties, when we're on no one side except the civilians.
Yes.
And all I can report to you is that over the years of the Syrian conflict, to take that as an example, although you could also use the example of Afghanistan, or you could use the example of Sudan, other places, we have really difficult negotiations, discussions about where to work. Our
Yes.
teams face danger. More humanitarian aid workers have been killed in the last year than for many years previously. But I can report that in the northwest of Syria, where the new governing authority that will be convening a government for the whole of Syria has been in charge, we have been able to establish
Yes.
a modus operandi, a way of working that has respected the most important principles of humanitarian need and humanitarian work. Just a practical example with your time, you'll remember there was an earthquake in the northwest of Syria as if they didn't have enough problems. In February 2023, there was a massive earthquake. We were able to get on with our business there. And the governing authorities, we worked through a civil administration was established, not the armed opposition groups themselves, and they were permissive in the way that they allowed us to do our work because we
Yes.
were serving the people, 3.5 million of them trapped in the northwest of Syria.
Yes.
That's the basis on which I would say we should judge the new authorities by their actions um, today. And it's interesting that the new prime minister of Syria is the man who was in charge of the civil administration in the northwest of Syria
Yes.
in the recent past.
Yes. I mean, so look, you are engaging then with HTS, and from what you've seen so far, there does seem to be grounds for, I don't know, maybe fragile hope, and if not as far as to say optimism. So I guess that would be a straw to clutch at if you're looking into the future and looking for grounds for hope. Have you, David? Have you been in contact yourself with the senior leadership of HTS? You mentioned the Prime Minister, who's got some experience in dealing with the stuff that you deal with. What about Al-Jilani? Would you expect to talk to Al-Jilani at any point? Is that a good idea or necessary or on your list of things to do?
Well, it's not necessary for me to do my job to speak to those people, and I haven't spoken to them. As I said, there was a civil administration established in the northwest of Syria, and one of our principles of our humanitarian work is that we use local people in the places that we work. 97% of our 21,000 staff members around the
Mm,
world are from the places that we are working.
yes.
And so that's not that's the basis on which we engage. Now, going forward, it's absolutely critical, I think, that the international system is clear
Yeah.
about what it expects and what it wants. And
Yes.
that's the only basis on which we can work. I have to say, we're showing today that 305 million people in the world are dependent on humanitarian aid organizations to survive.
Mm,
They are, in a way, a symptom of global political failure, what we call a world out of balance.
yeah.
Diplomacy has been in retreat, hard power has been holding the upper hand. We know that civilians are bearing the brunt of war, not soldiers.
Yes.
And this world out of balance needs urgent correction. There's no one answer to that. What you're seeing in Syria and elsewhere is there are many players in the new world order,
Yes.
and they need to get their act together.
Right. Look, so if international engagement is vital, what is your message then? Let's start with the American administration. What is your message to the outgoing administration of Joe Biden and the incoming one of Donald Trump when it comes to what they can usefully, practically, helpfully do?
Well, I would pick up your words. Let's be practical and let's be realistic. Number one, open the aid corridors from Iraq, from Turkey into Syria. Number two, sustain the health system across Syria, because when a health system collapses, a country collapses.
Mm,
Number three, be clear that hyperinflation is a problem, is a danger, and the sustenance of the banking system is very important. Number four, there are 7 million refugees from Syria, most of them in neighboring countries, 3 million in Turkey, 1 million in Lebanon, probably 600,000 in Jordan. There's 700,000 in Germany. There's 16,000, 17,000 in the UK. They need to be given the space to make a voluntary decision about going back. All of them, Syrians I've met in all those countries. I've met Syrians in the UK, but also
yeah.
in Germany and in Jordan and Lebanon. The only time they've really smiled is when you say to them, "Do you think you'll ever go home?" They've sustained the idea that they would go home, even when their home's been bombed.
Mm,
But they've been afraid to go home because they thought they would be conscripted into Assad's army. They thought they
yes.
wouldn't be safe if they went home. Let's give them the space to go home. So I think there is a practical set of things. One other thing, sorry for the long answer.
No, no.
One other thing, let's be clear. Let's ask the international system, let's ask countries to be clear about what they're expecting. This has been a big shakeup of the politics of the Middle East. Turkey is much stronger. Iran, much weaker. Russia, much, much weaker. America has not actually been part of this big change. Europe, not really part of this big change. Let's be absolutely clear. It's in everyone's interest for Syria to be a sovereign territory, for Syria to be governed in a pluralistic way. Remember, 5% of Syrians are Christians. It's got a balance of Sunni and Shia Muslims. It needs to be an inclusive political system. It needs to play by the international rules. Let's be clear about that as an international system
Yeah.
so that then there are proper tests for what the authorities do.
Okay. Look, as we speak, sticking with America, the United States is bombing ISIS sites for reasons that we can understand. Sites where potentially lethal weapons are said to be stored. Donald Trump is isolationist, but also hawkish in defense of what he sees as US interests. And some of those around him are even more hawkish than anything we've seen for a very long time. Does any of that give you ground for concern?
Well, the situation on the ground gives ground for concern, not least because we've got people in the northeast of Syria as well as in the northwest, in the areas that you're talking about. That northeastern area of Syria, you know this, I don't know whether it's helpful for your listeners. That northeastern part of Syria is Kurdish controlled. It's where, and so there's a big interest of the Turks there. It's got ISIS there. That's why the Americans are there to stop them rolling the table. And that's the situation that's of concern to me.
Mm.
Now, I think that we've got to recognize that there are dangers here when the state collapses. For all that there's hope that we described on the part of Syrians around the world, there's also real danger. And you don't want the vacuum to be exploited by ISIS. You do need there to be urgent work to reestablish or establish some governing authority and governing principles. We can't afford the society to collapse. When it comes to the Trump administration, it is interesting that America is not the lead player in this drama that has unfolded over the last 10 days
Yeah.
in Syria. And it's also interesting that there are different strands of thinking within the Trump coalition. You mentioned isolationism, and there are some who certainly argue that America would be better off if it wasn't entangled abroad. There are others who are very focused on Chinese influence, and there are still others who cleave to the slightly older idea of American primacy. So I don't think it's simple to describe or to know how those differences will play out. Obviously, it's important that any foreign power is a force for stability, not instability, because there are enough wars already in the Middle East.
Yes. I mean, look, here and around the world, we're seeing reports and images that just demonstrate the horror of the Assad regime, the military prison where people were tortured, were locked up and forgotten. The sight of thousands of Syrians outside that military prison, hoping desperately against all hope that they may see their loved one again, and so many of them will not. There is horror around the world. Was that horror lacking until this point?
Well, I think that Syria had become the forgotten conflict. If you think back 10 years ago, then there were lots of discussions on programs like yours and elsewhere of what was going on. But over the last 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years, the horror and the need in Syria has slipped off the international agenda. People were a bit surprised when we published our emergency watch list last year for 2024, Syria was still on it. And people were saying, oh, I didn't realize Syria was still in such a bad way, because they'd heard the war was over. But the trauma, all you need to do is speak to one refugee Syrian and say to them, why did you leave? And they say, well, my kid was tortured in Daraa. My house was bombed in Damascus. My family was driven out of Deir ez-Zor. You hear that from the first moment of testimony. And every family, every Syrian family was touched by it. And of course, it's not the only horror. I mean, Sudan has 30 million people in humanitarian need today. Gaza, I don't need to tell you, horrific situation. So there's competition for news space. But you're right, the wounds of war don't get healed until they are healed. And they haven't been healed yet in the Syrian case.
All right, David, I'll let you go there. It's been really good to talk to you again. Take care.